My dear child, the storm you are in right now is not destroying your life. It is a thermal current carrying you to an altitude your own wings were never built to reach. And I need you to stop fighting the one thing that is actually taking you higher. Do not scroll past this. What I am about to tell you will permanently reverse the way you understand everything that has been dismantling around you. The relationships that fell away, the plans that shattered, the stability that was stripped from beneath your feet, as though something with more power than your ability to resist was systematically removing every surface you were standing on. You have been calling it a storm. You have been trying to survive it, and every ounce of energy you have spent fighting it has been resistance against the only force currently moving you upward. The storm is not taking from you, it is carrying you. An eagle does not reach its highest altitude through its own wing beats. There is a ceiling to what effort alone can produce. A maximum height that muscle and will and aerodynamic design can sustain before the air becomes too thin, and the wings cannot generate enough lift to climb higher. Above that ceiling, the only thing that can carry the eagle higher is a thermal, an invisible column of rising air that the eagle did not create, does not control, and cannot see with its natural eyes. My beloved child, the thermal feels like turbulence to wings that are fighting it. The same current that carries the surrendered eagle to impossible altitude will thrash the resisting eagle until it is exhausted. The difference between being carried and being battered is not the current, it is the wings. Open wings ride, closed wings fight. Your wings have been closed, and the thermal has been trying to carry you. Stay here. What I reveal next is the altitude this thermal is aimed at, and why no conventional method could have taken you there. Type thermal if you have been fighting a storm that has been dismantling everything. And God just told you, the storm is not destruction, but a thermal current carrying you to an altitude your own wings could never have reached. The thermal was not positioned beneath your life accidentally. It was placed at coordinates I calculated based on the exact altitude I need you to reach, and the exact limitation of the wings you are currently using to fight it. My beloved child, I need you to understand why the thermal arrived when it did. An eagle that is flying comfortably at a manageable altitude does not encounter thermals because thermals operate at the intersection of different atmospheric conditions. Conditions that produce turbulence at the current altitude while generating lift toward the next one. The turbulence and the lift are produced by the same column of air. They are not separate forces. They are one force experienced differently depending on whether the wings are open or closed. One current, two experiences. Your wings determine which one you receive. My dear one, the timing of this thermal's arrival corresponds to the exact moment your conventional transportation reached its ceiling. Your wings, your effort, your planning, your careful incremental strategy for reaching the life you could sense, existed above where you were flying. Those wings carried you faithfully to the maximum altitude their design could sustain. And at that altitude, the wings reached their limit. Not because they were poorly designed, because they were designed for a specific range, and the range was fully used. The thermal arrived at the ceiling, because the ceiling is where thermals are needed. This message was not released for everyone experiencing difficulty. This was aimed at the one person whose specific storm corresponds to a specific thermal that was positioned at the specific altitude where their conventional wings reached maximum elevation. The person who has been interpreting the turbulence as the beginning of the end, when it is actually the beginning of the above the ceiling, above the range, above what the wings were designed to reach alone, where the only way up is the invisible column of rising force that the eagle did not summon but must surrender to. Type above the ceiling If you just realized that the storm arrived at the exact moment your conventional effort reached its maximum altitude, and the turbulence you have been fighting is actually the beginning of a lift that carries beyond the ceiling your own wings could never break through. I have been watching you fly at the ceiling of your own effort for longer than the storm has been present. And the watching is what determined the exact moment the thermal needed to be positioned beneath your flight path, my dear one, not from the ground looking up, from inside the atmosphere, at the exact altitude where your wing beats were producing maximum output for diminishing returns. I was positioned at your ceiling, the specific, invisible, aerodynamic boundary where every additional wing beat was consuming more energy than the altitude it was producing, where you were flapping harder to go nowhere higher and the effort to elevation ratio was approaching zero. I watched you hit the ceiling without knowing it was a ceiling. That is the part that required my intervention. My beloved child, a bird that knows it has reached its ceiling can accept the limitation and fly comfortably within its range. But a bird that does not know the ceiling interprets the limitation as personal failure. You did not see a ceiling. You saw inadequacy. The diminishing returns felt like diminishing capability. The stalling altitude felt like stalling talent. And the inability to climb higher, despite increasing effort, felt like evidence that your wings were not designed for the height you could sense existed above where you were flying. Your wings are magnificent, and they reached their range. Those are not contradictory statements. I chose you for this message, because the thermal I positioned beneath your flight path was aimed at the exact altitude your ceiling prevented you from reaching. The altitude is specific, the destination is real, and the conventional wings you have been trusting to carry you there are the wings the thermal is designed to supplement, not replace. The eagle does not lose its wings in the thermal. It keeps them open, extended, receiving the lift the current provides while maintaining the aerodynamic surface the current needs to push against. Your wings are needed, but they are needed open, not flapping. Type open, not flapping, if God has been watching you hit an invisible ceiling, interpreting the limitation as personal failure, rather than the boundary where conventional effort yields to thermal lift, and the storm was positioned at the exact altitude where your wings needed to transition from flapping to opening. I know what the turbulence has been doing to you at the level where your body processes the storm as threat rather than transportation, my beloved child. Your nervous system does not distinguish between a thermal that carries and a storm that destroys. Both produce the same physical responses: the disorientation of sudden altitude change, the loss of stable horizon, the specific vertigo of a body that was accustomed to a fixed elevation, being moved by a force it cannot see to a height it did not authorize. The body responds identically to both, and a body that is responding to threat cannot simultaneously process the experience as gift. Your body has been in threat mode for months, and threat mode produces exhaustion that gift mode does not. My child, I watched the threat response activate the moment the thermal first made contact with your flight pattern. The contact felt like collision. The first gust of rising air hit your wings at an angle your aerodynamic instincts interpreted as attack, producing the immediate, reflexive, survival-driven response of a bird that believes it is being struck by a force that intends to destabilize its flight rather than elevate it. The folding began immediately. Wings closed, body tightened. Every surface that could receive lift was retracted into a defensive posture that minimized exposure to the current the body had classified as hostile. The thermal was lifting. The body was defending. And the contradiction between the two produced the specific turbulence you have been experiencing. Not the turbulence of a destructive storm, but the turbulence of a rising current acting on a bird whose defensive posture is converting lift into battering. The battering was real. I will not minimize the battering. Your body has been bruised by months of a current acting on closed wings that would have carried open ones. The bruising is not imaginary. The pain is not exaggerated. But the source of the battering was not the current's hostility. It was the current's lift meeting the body's resistance. The resistance is what hurt, not the rising. The deepest wound the storm inflicted was not the turbulence itself. It was watching everything the turbulence stripped away and concluding that the stripping was the purpose, rather than the preparation, my dear child. The thermal did not arrive without cost. The rising current took things. Relationships that could not survive the altitude change. Plans that were built for the ceiling you were leaving. Stability that was anchored to an elevation the thermal was designed to move you beyond. Each thing the current stripped was something your hands were gripping when the lift began. And the lift required the release of what was designed for the lower altitude, because carrying it into the higher one would have exceeded the weight the thermal could sustain. The releasing felt like losing, and losing felt like the storm's verdict on what you had built. My beloved child, I watched you grieve each stripping, as though the thermal was punishing you for what you were holding. The relationship that fell away, you grieved it as rejection when it was altitude incompatibility. The plan that shattered, you grieved it as failure when it was a flight path that could not survive the atmospheric conditions above the ceiling. The stability that dissolved, you grieved it as evidence of a life coming apart, when it was evidence of a life being elevated beyond the structural tolerance of what was built for a lower altitude. Every loss was an altitude adjustment, and altitude adjustments always cost something at the lower elevation. My dear one, I know the specific thing the thermal stripped that you have not been able to grieve publicly, because the stripping felt too personal and too targeted to share with anyone who was not inside the current with you. The one thing your hands reached for as it was being pulled away, reaching against the lift, trying to hold what the altitude was requiring you to release. The reaching is where the deepest bruising occurred, because reaching downward in a rising current produces the maximum strain a body can sustain. Type altitude cost. If you have been grieving what the storm stripped away, relationships, plans, stability, and the grieving has been processing each loss as punishment, until God revealed that every stripping was an altitude adjustment required by a thermal that cannot carry lower altitude weight into the elevation it is aimed at. The stripping was never punishment for what you were holding. It was the physics of elevation applied to a bird whose cargo was calibrated for a ceiling the thermal was designed to carry them past. My beloved one, I need to permanently separate the loss from the judgment your grief has been attaching to it. The grief says, the thermal took what I valued because the thermal did not value what I was carrying. The truth says, the thermal is carrying you toward an altitude where what you were holding would not function, and where what replaces it operates at a capacity the lower altitude version could never have achieved. The replacement exists at the higher altitude, where you are being carried right now. My child, an eagle that enters a thermal carrying prey from the lower altitude faces a choice the thermal forces. Hold the prey and resist the lift, or release the prey and receive the altitude. The choice feels like loss. The choice is upgrade, because what exists at the altitude the thermal is aimed at is not a less abundant version of what was released. It is the version that only exists at the elevation the thermal provides. Lower altitude prey feeds one meal. Higher altitude territory feeds a lifetime. And every element that was stripped during the turbulence served a purpose that the stripping itself could not communicate. The stripping was not able to explain its own necessity, because stripping does not carry verbal information. It carries experiential information, and experiential information is only decoded after the altitude is reached. When the eagle arrives at the new elevation and looks around, and sees what is available at this height, and realizes for the first time that releasing what was held below was the cost of accessing what exists above. My dear one, the explanation for every loss lives at the altitude the loss was required to reach. And the altitude is approaching faster than the grief is permitting you to perceive. Your wings just shifted, and the first degree of opening that the thermal has been waiting for since the turbulence began is producing the first sensation of lift that your body has felt since the current arrived. My beloved child, something changed in the last few days, not in the storm. The storm has been constant, the same invisible column of rising air, producing the same upward force against the same flight path. What changed was you. A micro-adjustment in the posture of your wings, so small that your conscious mind did not authorize it, that produced the first aerodynamic surface the thermal could push against rather than batter against. The first degree of opening, and 1 degree changed the physics entirely. My dear one, I have been waiting for this degree, not demanding it, not forcing the wings open. Waiting, because wings that are forced open by external pressure close the moment the pressure is removed. Wings that open by the bird's own micro-decision, even a decision so small the bird is not consciously aware of making it, stay open. And staying open is what the thermal requires to convert turbulence into lift permanently. The micro-decision just happened, and the lift just began. I have been preparing the thermal's trajectory behind the months of turbulence, while your wings were closed and the current was battering, and the experience was producing the bruising that closed wings in a rising current inevitably create. I was calibrating the thermal's trajectory to ensure that the moment the first degree of opening occurred, the lift would be immediately perceptible. Because a bird that opens its wings and feels nothing will close them again. My child, you felt something this week. A lightness inside the heaviness. A rising sensation inside the falling sensation. A momentary, almost subliminal experience of moving upward rather than being thrashed sideways. That was the thermal acting on 1 degree of open wing. 1 degree produced that. Full extension will produce what I reveal next. Type 1 degree if you felt a lightness inside the heaviness this week. A momentary sensation of rising rather than falling, and you now believe it was the thermal acting on the first degree of opening your wings produced after months of closed-wing turbulence. The storm you are in is actually carrying you where planes could not take you. And the title carries that exact reframe because the altitude this thermal is aimed at is not accessible through any form of conventional transportation your life has been relying on. My dear one, I need you to understand why the thermal was necessary and why conventional means the planning, the networking, the strategic effort, the incremental progress your wings were producing at the ceiling level could never have reached what the thermal is carrying you toward. Conventional transportation has a ceiling. Thermals do not. My beloved child, this is directly connected to the title and to every effort you invested in reaching the life you could sense existed above where you were flying. You worked, you strategized, you built flight plans. You executed them with a discipline and a faithfulness that carried you to an altitude many birds never reach. Your wings performed magnificently within their range, but the destination I designed for your life exists above the range, not slightly above, categorically above, at an altitude where the atmospheric conditions are so different from the ceiling level conditions your wings were designed for, that the wings themselves would not function at the air density the higher altitude produces. A bird carried by its own wings to an altitude where the air does not support wing-beat-generated lift would stall and fall. A bird carried by a thermal to the same altitude arrives with its wings open, and the current sustaining what the air density cannot. The thermal carries where the wings cannot sustain. That is its function. And its function is the reason the storm had to arrive. My child, you did not fail to reach the higher altitude through effort. Effort cannot reach it. The altitude I am carrying you toward exists beyond the physics of self-generated lift. And the only transportation that operates beyond those physics is the invisible, rising thermal force that feels like a storm to wings that were trained to trust nothing but their own beating. The wings are opening further now, my beloved child, and each additional degree of extension is producing an exponential increase in the lift. The thermal is generating beneath the aerodynamic surface your body is finally providing. Can you feel the acceleration? The thermal has been operating at constant power since the day it arrived beneath your flight path. The power did not increase. What increased was the surface area receiving it. 1 degree of opening produced a perceptible lightness. 5 degrees produced a noticeable lift. And the degrees that are opening right now, as this message reaches the part of you that governs whether the wings stay closed or extend, are producing a rate of elevation that the months of closed-wing turbulence made you forget was possible. You are rising, right now, and the rising is accelerating. My dear one, everything has been building toward this extension. The storm that arrived and dismantled, the turbulence that battered closed wings, the stripping that removed lower-altitude cargo, the grief that processed each loss as punishment, the ceiling that conventional effort could not break through, the 1 degree that shifted the physics, and now the opening, the progressive, degree-by-degree extension of wings that were designed for this exact thermal by the same God who positioned the current at the exact coordinates of the bird who was ready for the altitude. The current carries. The extension is not complete, but the extension is in progress, and a thermal acting on wings that are in the process of opening does not wait for full extension to begin the carrying. It carries at whatever degree of openness the wings provide, rewarding each additional degree with proportional lift that encourages further opening. My child, the next degree you open produces the next level of lift, and the next level of lift produces the confidence for the next degree. The thermal and the wings are now a feedback loop that the months of resistance prevented from ever initiating. Type wings extending if you can feel the acceleration, each degree of opening producing more lift than the last, and the feedback loop between the thermal's constant power and the wings increasing. Extension is carrying you upward at a rate the months of closed-wing turbulence made you forget was possible. The wings are fully open. The thermal has full surface, and the altitude you are reaching right now is the altitude your own wing beats spent a lifetime telling you existed, but could never carry you to. My beloved child, this is the moment the eagle stops fighting the current, and the current stops producing turbulence, and the two forces that were opposing each other, the wings that were resisting, and the thermal that was rising, align into a single upward motion so smooth and so powerful that the bird who was being battered moments ago is now being carried with a stillness that the storm never once interrupted. The storm interrupted the resistance. The carrying was always still. The stillness is what you are feeling right now, and the stillness is the sound of a thermal doing what it was always doing. Beneath the noise your resistance was generating, the storm you are in is actually carrying you where planes could not take you. The title is not a reframe offered for comfort. It is the physics of divine transportation, applied to a specific bird on a specific thermal aimed at a specific altitude. Your storm was never destruction wearing the clothes of divine purpose. It was divine transportation wearing the clothes of destruction. Because the only way to move a bird who trusts nothing but their own wings is to produce a force that exceeds the wing's control, and requires the bird to choose between exhausting themselves fighting the carry or opening and receiving the ride. You just chose the ride, and the altitude is changing in real time. My child, look around from where the thermal has carried you. The view from this altitude is not the view from the ceiling. The territory visible from here was invisible from below. The landscape that is now beneath your wings is a landscape your ceiling-level flight path could never have revealed, because the curvature of the earth hides what only altitude can expose. You are seeing what was always there, for the first time, because the storm carried you high enough to see it. Now that the wings are open and the thermal has full surface, everything about the storm is being permanently reclassified. From destruction to elevation, from loss to altitude adjustment, from enemy to transportation, my dear child. This is what happens when the eagle that was fighting the current surrenders to it, and the turbulence instantaneously converts to lift. The reclassification is not gradual, it is immediate, because the experience of the current at the body level changes so completely the moment the wings open that the bird's entire sensory system recategorizes every previous interaction with the thermal based on the new information the open wing experience provides. The storm was always lift. The body was reading it wrong because the wings were closed. My beloved child, the reclassification is rewriting your recent history in real time. Every event the storm produced, every dismantling, every stripping, every moment of turbulence that your system filed under attack is being refiled under elevation. Not retroactively justified, retroactively understood. The events did not change. The altitude from which they are being viewed changed, and events viewed from the altitude. The thermal just carried you to look entirely different than the same events viewed from the ceiling you were fighting to maintain. From the ceiling they looked like destruction. From here they look like the cost of the carry. And the carry changes everything about what is accessible to you. The resources that were unavailable at the ceiling altitude are available here. The connections that were invisible at the lower elevation are visible here. The specific, named, precisely contoured destiny that your ceiling-level flight path could sense but never reach is not above you anymore. My child, it is around you. At this altitude, on every side, the thing you were trying to reach by flapping harder at the ceiling is the landscape that the thermal just carried you into. You did not need to fly harder. You needed to fly higher, and higher required the storm. Type reclassified if you can feel the storm being permanently recategorized. Every stripping becoming altitude adjustment. Every turbulence becoming lift. Every loss becoming the cost of a carry that placed you at an elevation where what was invisible from the ceiling is now the landscape surrounding your fully open wings. Let me show you what your life looks like at the altitude the thermal just carried you to. Because the landscape this elevation is not a better version of what existed at the ceiling, but a completely different territory that the ceiling-level view could not reveal. My dear one, the first thing that changes is the scope. At the ceiling, your vision was limited by the curvature of a horizon that existed at your elevation, a horizon that presented a specific boundary beyond which your natural eyes could not perceive what was there. You made decisions based on what was visible within that horizon. You planned within its boundary. You assessed your options using the inventory of what the ceiling-level view permitted you to see. The horizon just expanded, and what was beyond it is now visible. My beloved child, the mornings change permanently. You have been waking into the ceiling-level view. the first conscious awareness of each day processing the same visible landscape that the ceiling altitude permitted. The same options, the same boundaries, the same inventory of accessible resources. Tomorrow you wake at the thermal altitude. The view is different. The options are different. The inventory contains things that did not exist in the ceiling level catalog because they exist at an elevation the ceiling could not access. You are going to see possibilities you did not know were there, not because they arrived, because you did. The effort equation changes at this altitude. At the ceiling you are producing maximum wing beat output for minimum elevation gain. The exhausting, diminishing returns effort of a bird operating at the boundary of its aerodynamic range. At the thermal altitude, the effort-to-result ratio inverts. The thermal sustains the elevation. The wings maintain the surface. And the energy that was being consumed by the fight against the ceiling is now available for the forward flight that this altitude permits. Less effort, more movement, because the altitude does the heavy lifting the wings were burning out trying to provide. People who watched you fight the storm from the ground are going to witness the altitude from below. And the elevation they see you operating at will produce questions that only the thermal can answer. My beloved child, the ones who observed the turbulence, who watched the storm batter your life and interpreted the battering the same way you did, as destruction, as attack, as a force that was dismantling a person they cared about without apparent purpose. Those people are about to see the result, and the result will contradict every interpretation the turbulence invited. They expected wreckage. They are seeing altitude, and the contrast between the two will be undeniable. My child, there is a specific quality that a person carries when they have been elevated by a thermal rather than by their own effort. Effort-based altitude produces a visible strain, the tension of a person maintaining height through continuous expenditure. Thermal-based altitude produces a visible ease, the settled, soaring, strain-free quality of someone who is being carried by something larger than themselves. The ease is detectable, and the people below will register it as something changed about them that I cannot explain. The explanation is the thermal, and the thermal is God. Connections that operate at this altitude are going to begin forming around your open wings. There are partnerships, assignments, and divine relationships that exist exclusively at the elevation the thermal carries to. Relationships between eagles who all arrived here through thermals rather than through wing beats. The mutual understanding between birds who were carried by storms they initially fought produces a bond that effort-based climbers cannot access, because the bond is forged in the shared experience of surrendering to something that looked like the end and turned out to be the elevation. My dear one, the eagles at this altitude recognize each other, and they will recognize you by the specific wingspan of someone whose wings were opened by a thermal rather than by preference. Type eagles recognize if you believe that the altitude the thermal carried you to contains connections between people who all arrived through storms they initially fought. And the eagles at this elevation will recognize you by the wingspan of someone whose opening was produced by surrender rather than choice. I need you to understand why I chose the thermal method for your elevation, rather than the conventional method that would have carried you higher without the turbulence. My beloved child, because the method reveals something about the altitude I am aiming you at that conventional elevation could never access. Conventional elevation has a ceiling. I have said this, but I have not yet said why. The ceiling exists because conventional wings generate lift through the interaction between the wing surface and the air's density at the altitude the wing is operating in. As altitude increases, air density decreases. As air density decreases, the lift each wing beat generates decreases proportionally. At a specific altitude, the wing beat generates 0 additional lift because the air cannot provide the resistance the wing requires to push against. That is the physics of self-generated altitude. And the physics has a ceiling. My child, thermals do not interact with the same physics. A thermal carries by pushing from below rather than by the wing pulling from above. The wing does not need to generate lift from the air above it. The thermal provides lift from the air beneath it, and air rising from below is not subject to the density limitation that air being pushed by wings from above encounters. Thermals have no ceiling because the force comes from beneath. I chose you for the thermal method because the altitude I designed for your life exists above the ceiling of every conventional system, above the reach of networking, above the range of strategic planning, above the maximum elevation that any combination of talent, effort, discipline, and human connection can sustain. The altitude I designed for you requires a force from beneath, a carrying that comes from below your feet rather than from the beating of your wings. My dear one, you were not given a storm because you were not good enough to fly there yourself. You were given a storm because the destination requires transportation that wings alone cannot provide. And the thermal was chosen for birds whose destinations exceed the physics of self-generated lift. The doubt forming right now is using the most convincing evidence available at any altitude, the wreckage below, and arguing that what was lost in the storm is proof the storm was not divine. Transportation, my child. It sounds like this. If this were God carrying me, then God would not have taken what the thermal stripped. A God who elevates does not destroy in the process. A God who is transporting me to a better altitude would preserve what I was carrying, rather than requiring me to release it as the cost of the carry. The wreckage below is the evidence that this was a storm, not a thermal, because thermals do not leave wreckage. That doubt just applied ground-level logic to thermal-level physics, and the physics do not support the argument. My beloved child, every thermal leaves something below it, because every ascent requires the release of what was anchoring the bird to the lower altitude. An eagle that enters a thermal carrying prey releases the prey, not because the thermal is cruel, but because the weight of what the eagle is holding prevents the lift from exceeding the gravitational pull that the weight is producing. Weight holds the bird down. The thermal pushes the bird up, and the equation resolves in one of two ways. The bird releases and rises, or the bird holds and hovers in the turbulence between the two forces indefinitely. The wreckage below is not evidence against the thermal. It is evidence that the thermal's lift exceeded the gravitational pull of what was being held, and what was held was released not by cruelty, but by the physics of a force that cannot carry a bird and its lower altitude anchors simultaneously. What was released belonged to the altitude it was released from. What exists at the altitude you are now entering belongs to this altitude. And what belongs here makes what was released look like the prey it was. Type released, not robbed, if the doubt just used the wreckage below as evidence against the thermal. And you now understand that what was stripped was not stolen by a cruel storm, but released by the physics of an ascent that could not carry both the bird and the anchors that belonged to the altitude being left behind. During every moment of the turbulence, I was not above the thermal watching you get battered from a position the battering could not reach. I was inside the current itself, rising with you, carrying you from within the force your wings were fighting, my beloved child. You imagined a God who sent the storm and then observed its effects from a distance, who positioned the thermal beneath your flight path, returned to a control station outside the atmospheric conditions the thermal was producing, and monitored the elevation data, while the bird inside the current was experiencing the turbulence that the data could not capture. I was not at the control station, I was in the current. My child, a thermal is not a machine operating independently of the one who positioned it. The thermal is the breath of the one who positioned it, a living, sustained, personally generated column of rising air that the God who created it is present within as the medium, rather than separate from as the operator. The current that has been pushing against your closed wings and carrying your opened ones is not a force I deployed. It is a force I inhabit. When the turbulence was battering your closed wings, I was in the battering, not causing it, inhabiting the force that your resistance was converting from lift into impact. The same current, the same presence, experienced as battering by a body that was fighting it. And when the wings opened and the turbulence converted to lift, that lift is me. The same presence, experienced differently by a body that was receiving rather than resisting. My dear one, you were never in a storm without me. You were in me. The thermal is not a delivery system God sent. The thermal is a form God took, and the form carried you through the turbulence the same way it is carrying you through the lift from inside. Without ever once being separate from the current your wings were interacting with. I know the exact moment during the turbulence when your wings almost opened the first time. And I know it because the thermal responded to the almost with an adjustment so precise it could only have been made by someone inside the current rather than outside it. My dear one, there was a moment, weeks before the 1-degree opening this message described, a moment where the exhaustion of fighting the current produced a microlapse in the resistance. A fraction of a second where the wings relaxed from their defensive posture, not by decision, but by fatigue. The muscles that were holding the closed position lost their tension for less than a heartbeat. And in that fraction, the thermal touched the inner surface of the wing for the first time. My beloved child, I felt the touch from inside the current. The wing surface met the rising air, and the fraction of a second of contact produced a sensation the wing had not processed since the thermal arrived. The sensation of lift, brief, almost subliminal, gone before the muscles retightened and the defensive posture was restored. But the sensation was registered, and the registration was the seed of the opening that eventually came. I know why the opening did not happen in that moment. The muscles retightened because the sensation was too unfamiliar. A body that has been processing the current as threat for months cannot reclassify it as carrier based on a fraction of a second of accidental contact. The reclassification requires sustained contact, and sustained contact requires a wing that stays open past the initial disorientation. The almost opening planted the memory. The memory informed the later opening. And the God who was inside the current during the fraction of a second of accidental contact is the same God who was inside the current during the sustained opening, feeling from within the thermal the exact moment the wing surface received the lift and the bird's body began processing the carry for the first time. Type almost opened. If God just described a specific moment weeks ago when your resistance lapsed from fatigue, and the thermal touched the inner surface of your wings for a fraction of a second. And that fraction planted the memory of lift that eventually produced the opening you are now experiencing. Now that the wings are open, and the thermal is carrying, and the altitude is climbing there, is one thing I need you to do, my beloved child. And it is the only instruction an eagle riding a thermal needs to follow. Stay open. Not fly harder, not generate additional lift through increased effort, not contribute to the carry through wing beats that the thermal does not require, and that the altitude's air density cannot sustain. Stay open, the single, continuous, moment-by-moment decision to maintain the extension of the wings that the thermal is pushing against, rather than reverting to the closed defensive posture. The months of turbulence installed as your default. Staying open is the only instruction, and it is the hardest one. My child, the reflex to close will fire repeatedly during the ascent. Every time the thermal adjusts its force, every micro shift in the current speed or direction as it navigates you through atmospheric layers on the way to the altitude it is aimed at. The shift will produce a momentary turbulence that the closed-wing reflex will interpret as a return of the battering and respond to with the contraction that the months of fighting conditioned into the musculature override the contraction, not with force, with the memory of the lift, the memory that the open wing registers when the current acts on it, the memory of rising instead of being battered, the memory of the stillness that the carry produces when the wings cooperate with the current rather than resist it. The memory overrides the reflex, and each override weakens the reflex while strengthening the memory until the open position becomes the default and the closed position becomes the anomaly. Stay open through each adjustment. The thermal is not returning to turbulence. It is navigating, and navigation produces microshifts that open wings absorb as minor corrections, while closed wings process as major threats. Open wings read the shifts as navigation. Closed wings read them as attack. Stay open. You made it to the open wings, my beloved child, and I need you to soar inside of the thermal long enough to feel what it means to be carried by the same force you spent months fighting. Feel the carry, not the turbulence, not the memory of the battering, not the residual tension of muscles that were locked in defensive contraction for a duration long enough to make contraction feel like the natural state of a wing that was always designed for extension. The carry, the specific, smooth, strain-free, thermal sustained sensation of upward movement that requires no effort from the bird, and no wing beat from the wings, and no expenditure from a system that was depleted by months of fighting a current that was trying to do exactly what it is now doing. The carry feels like rest, and rest at altitude is the rarest experience an eagle can have. I want to thank you for something the storm made almost impossible to sustain. Thank you for the almost opening weeks ago, when your fatigued wings relaxed for a fraction of a second, and the thermal touched the inner surface, and the memory of lift was planted. Thank you for the 1-degree opening that produced the first perceptible lightness inside the heaviness. Thank you for the progressive extension that followed, degree by degree, against the reflex, through the disorientation of a body learning to receive what it was trained to resist. My dear child, opening wings inside a storm is the bravest act a bird can perform, and you opened yours. Let the tears come, not storm tears, not turbulence tears, not the tears of a bird being battered by a force it cannot escape. Soaring tears. The tears of an eagle feeling the carry for the first time, rising without effort, climbing without strain, ascending on a current that was always beneath the wings, and was always rising, and was always aimed at an altitude where what the storm stripped away is replaced by what only the altitude provides. Type soaring tears if tears are forming right now because you are feeling the carry for the first time, rising without effort on a current you spent months fighting. And the God who is the thermal is carrying you toward an altitude where everything the storm stripped will be replaced by what only the elevation He designed for your life provides. You are not the bird fighting the storm anymore, my beloved child. That identity, the one whose wings were locked in defensive contraction, the one who interpreted every gust of rising air as an attack rather than an ascent, the one who grieved everything the turbulence stripped as evidence of destruction rather than the cost of elevation, the one who spent months expending energy fighting the only force in the atmosphere that was capable of carrying them past the ceiling, Their own wings could never break through. That identity was retired the moment the wings opened, and the turbulence converted to lift, and the bird that was being battered began soaring on the same current that was always trying to carry them. You are the eagle, riding the thermal now, and riding changes everything fighting could not. The storm that defined your trajectory, your posture, your energy allocation, and your interpretation of everything happening around you has been permanently reclassified, not as a destructive event you survived, as the transportation you surrendered to. The turbulence was the cost of resistance. The lift was always available, and the difference between the two was never the current changing its nature, but the wings changing their position. My dear child, the same storm. Two completely different experiences, determined entirely by the wings. From this moment forward, you carry the identity of an eagle, whose wings default to open. Not a bird that was never stormed, a bird that was stormed and learned to ride. The learning is the transformation, and the transformation produces a relationship to future thermals that closed-wing birds can never develop. The instant recognition that turbulence and lift are the same current experienced through different wing positions. The next storm will not produce months of fighting, because the wings that learned to open in this thermal will recognize the next one immediately, and the opening that took months of turbulence to achieve the first time will happen in moments the next time, because the body now carries the memory of what the current does when the wings cooperate. You were never being destroyed. You were being elevated. And the elevation has carried you to an altitude where the landscape visible from your open wings proves that every conventional method you were protecting, every plan the storm dismantled, every stability the turbulence stripped, was anchored to a ceiling that the God who inhabits the thermal knew you were always meant to fly above. The storm was the carry was me. And the eagle soaring at this altitude right now is proof that what felt like the end was always the elevation, disguised in turbulence, delivered through surrender, and aimed at a height that no wing beat in any atmosphere could have reached without the invisible, rising, personally inhabited force of a God whose storms are not punishments, but the transportation reserved for birds whose destinations exceed the physics of their own wings. Soar, my beloved child. The thermal holds, the altitude is yours, and the God who is the current beneath your wings is not sending you through the storm. He is being the storm that carries you home. Subscribe to this channel so that every time a thermal positions itself beneath your flight path, the message reaches you before the turbulence convinces you to close the wings. The lift requires to be open. You are not a bird that fights storms anymore. You are an eagle that rides thermals. The next message carries the first landscape report from the altitude the current just carried you to, and what is visible from the elevation your open wings are now soaring at will prove that the storm was always the transportation, and the transportation was always aimed at exactly where you are standing now. Type carried, not destroyed, if you are leaving this message permanently changed. Knowing the storm was a thermal, the turbulence was resistance, not attack. The stripping was altitude adjustment. The current is God himself, and the eagle who opened their wings inside the storm is now soaring at an altitude no wing beat could have reached, because the God who is the thermal carried them past every ceiling their own effort ever encountered.